Jane's eyes sparkled with excitement as she turned the key to her new apartment. The door creaked open, revealing a spacious living room bathed in afternoon sunlight. She couldn't believe her luck. After years of struggling in a cramped studio, she finally had a place to call her own. Jane dragged her suitcase inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. Jane as Jane. This is perfect. I can see myself living here for a long time. As Jane explored her new home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She chalked it up to nerves and the unfamiliarity of the space. As night fell, Jane settled onto her air mattress, surrounded by boxes. The city lights twinkled outside her window, a constant reminder of the vibrant world just beyond her walls. Little did she know, her peaceful new beginning was about to take a sinister turn. Jane jolted awake in the middle of the night. Something had disturbed her sleep. She lay still, listening intently. There it was again. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind her head. Tap, tap, tap. Jane's heart raced. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the pipes. Old buildings often made strange noises, but the tapping persisted. It grew louder, more insistent. Jane sat up, her eyes straining in the darkness. Jane as Jane. This is getting ridiculous. What is going on? The tapping was just the beginning. A few nights later, Jane woke to the sound of whispers, faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, but she couldn't make out the words. It was like listening to a conversation through a thick wall. Jane flicked on her bedside lamp, half expecting to see an intruder, but the room was empty. The whispers faded as suddenly as they had begun. Jane hugged her knees to her chest, trembling. She told herself it was just a vivid dream. But deep down, she knew she had been wide awake. The whispers had been real. Jane as Jane. I can't keep living like this. As days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences in Jane's apartment intensified. Objects would move on their own. She'd leave a book on the coffee table only to find it on the floor when she returned. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, creating pockets of icy air that made her shiver. Jane found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound or movement. One evening, as Jane was cooking dinner, all the cabinet doors in the kitchen flew open simultaneously. Dishes clattered to the floor, shattering into pieces. Jane stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel an unseen presence in the room with her. A cold breeze brushed against her skin, carrying with it the faint scent of tobacco. But Jane didn't smoke, and neither did any of her neighbors. Jane as Jane. This is too much. I can't take it anymore. Sleep became elusive. Jane would lie awake for hours, listening to the creaks and groans of the apartment. Sometimes she'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow darting across the room. A figure reflected in a mirror, only to vanish when she turned to look. She began to doubt her own sanity. Desperate for answers, Jane decided to do some digging into the history of her apartment building. She started with online searches, scouring local news archives and real estate records. At first, she found nothing out of the ordinary. The building had been constructed in the 1920s, renovated several times over the decades. But then, buried in an old newspaper article, she found something that made her blood run cold.
20 years ago, a man named Peter Lawson had lived in my very apartment. He was described as a recluse, rarely seen by his neighbors. One day the police were called to the building due to a foul odor. They found Peter's body in the bedroom closet. He had been dead for weeks. The article mentioned strange writings on the walls, but provided no details.
Jane's hands shook as she read the article. She felt a chill run down her spine. Determined to learn more, Jane reached out to the building's longtime residents. Most were hesitant to talk about Peter, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Rodriguez, invited Jane in for tea. With trembling hands, she recounted the story.
Peter had been a troubled man, she said. He claimed to hear voices, see things that weren't there. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that something evil was living in the walls of his apartment.
Overwhelmed by her discoveries, Jane knew she needed professional help. After some online research, she reached out to Dr. Amelia Foster, a renowned paranormal investigator. Despite her skepticism about such things, Jane was desperate for any explanation or solution.
I didn't really believe in this stuff, but I needed answers.
Dr. Foster agreed to visit the apartment, intrigued by Jane's story and the building's history. The day of Dr. Foster's arrival, Jane felt a mix of relief and apprehension.
There's definitely something here.
Dr. Foster murmured, her eyes scanning the room. She pulled out various devices, EMF meters, infrared cameras, audio recorders. Jane watched in fascination as Dr. Foster methodically swept through each room, taking readings and making notes.
This is where it's strongest.
In the bedroom, Dr. Foster's equipment went haywire. The EMF meter spiked, its lights flashing frantically. The temperature dropped suddenly, causing both women to shiver.
Has anything unusual happened in this room?
Yes, I hear whispers and objects move on their own.
Dr. Foster listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. As night fell, Dr. Foster suggested they conduct a seance to attempt communication with the spirit. Jane hesitated, fear gripping her heart. But her desire for answers outweighed her fear. The voice echoed through the room, sending shivers down Jane's spine. Dr. Foster remained calm, her years of experience evident in her steady demeanor.
Who are you?
There was a moment of silence, then the voice returned, stronger this time.
Peter, I'm trapped.
Jane's heart raced. It was the name from the newspaper article, the previous tenant who had died in this very apartment. Dr. Foster continued to ask questions, piecing together the spirit's story. Peter's voice grew more agitated as he spoke. He talked about a dark entity that had tormented him in life, and now kept his spirit bound to the apartment.
It feeds on fear. It wants to trap more souls.
As he spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a deep, menacing growl filled the air. It was unlike anything Jane had ever heard before.
We've awakened it.
The growl grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Objects began to fly across the room. As the chaos subsided, Dr. Foster and Jane caught their breath. The entity seemed to have retreated for the moment, but they knew it wasn't gone.
We need to understand more about Peter. His connection to this place is the key to everything.
They decided to try communicating with Peter's spirit again, hoping to learn the full truth of what happened in this apartment 2 decades ago. This time, Peter's voice came through clearer, as if he had gained strength. He began to tell his story, his words filled with pain and regret.
I could always sense the supernatural, see and hear things others couldn't. When I moved into this apartment, I immediately sensed a dark presence. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but it grew stronger, feeding on my fear and isolation. It tormented me day and night, whispering dark thoughts, moving objects, making me question my sanity.
Peter became a recluse, too afraid to leave the apartment but terrified of staying. He tried to warn others, but no one believed him. In his desperation, he turned to the occult, searching for a way to banish the entity. As Peter's story came to an end, a heavy silence fell over the room. Jane's mind reeled, trying to process everything she had just learned. Dr. Foster, however, was deep in thought.
Peter, you've been trying to protect the people who live here, haven't you? That's why Jane could hear the whispers, why things moved. You were trying to warn her.
Yes, but I'm not strong enough to stop it. It's growing more powerful with each passing year.
Dr. Foster nodded, her expression grim.
The ritual you performed, it wasn't completed correctly. That's why it didn't work as intended. But I think I know how we can fix it.
She turned to Jane, her eyes intense.
We need to complete the ritual. It's the only way to trap the entity and free Peter's spirit.
What does that mean? What do we need to do?
Dr. Foster explained that the ritual required a willing participant to act as a conduit. It wouldn't require a sacrifice, but it would be dangerous. The person performing the ritual would need to confront the entity directly, facing their deepest fears.
I'll do it.
Jane said, surprising herself with her own determination.